In just one night, Eleanor's life changed completely. Robert's death not only took away the lifelong companion she had been devoted to, but also left a cold void in the house. On the altar, smoke from the incense still lingered, and papers regarding the estate were scattered on the floor. Amidst the choking sobs, Eleanor heard the voices of her children arguing, and then a sentence that tore her heart apart. "This house should belong to me." In that moment, Eleanor understood that the greatest pain wasn't losing her husband, but facing the betrayal of the very children she had raised with a lifetime of sacrifice. At Robert Vance's funeral, Eleanor felt everything blur. It wasn't the crowd around her, but the emptiness she felt deep inside her. Her sorrow didn't just stem from Robert's death, but from the sense of being left alone in this world. A world she once thought she would share with him, walking hand in hand through the years. But today, she stood silently at the memorial, like a ghost, completely lost in the crowd. Robert was not just the wonderful husband she had loved, but also her closest friend. Throughout her life, she always believed that nothing could ever tear them apart. But his death was not only the end of a life, but the beginning of dark truths she never anticipated. Thomas, her eldest son, with his silver hair, stood in the crowd in front of Robert's casket. His gaze was unmoving, showing no sorrow at all. Thomas was always calm, never showing his emotions outwardly. But today, Eleanor could not help but feel the coldness in him. It wasn't respect or mourning, but indifference, as if Robert's death was just another necessary turning point in his life. Nothing more, nothing less. Eleanor couldn't help but wonder, is he thinking about what will happen to his father's assets? A wave of pain suddenly surged within her. Thomas was the child she had placed all her trust in, the son she thought would carry the family forward. But now, standing at Robert's funeral, his attitude felt like a silent betrayal. Each step he took, each glance exchanged with others at the funeral, made Eleanor feel more distant from her own son. David, her youngest, stood next to Thomas, silent. It seemed like he couldn't face his father's death. When he was younger, David was always the mischievous and sensitive one, but now he had become shy, avoiding all eye contact. Eleanor couldn't help but look at him and wonder if David truly understood the seriousness of the situation. Or was he simply avoiding his feelings, just as he always did when confronted with problems he couldn't solve? He stood silent, his eyes fixed on the casket without saying a word. But Eleanor felt a deep loneliness from him, as if he had completely given up on connecting with the family. Eleanor could no longer stand there. She felt the pain in her heart swell, a wave crashing inside her. Her whole life, she had done everything for the family, raising the children, protecting the family. But now, standing at Robert's funeral, she felt like an outsider, a person with no place in her own family. She quietly left the church, unnoticed by anyone, as tears ran down her cheeks. Each step she took felt like drifting on the sea of life, with no stopping point, no destination. The cold wind blew through, but it couldn't chase away the coldness in her heart. She looked out the car window, but the scenery outside seemed to blur, as if a fog had covered everything. Everything had become unclear. She only felt emptiness. Why was this happening? Why had everything changed so quickly? Her children, the ones she had spent her life nurturing, were now so cold. When she arrived home, Eleanor could not help but feel the silence in the house. The large house, once filled with sweet memories of her and Robert, was now empty. Everything was still the same as before, but it seemed lifeless. She walked into the living room where Robert always sat after a long day at work. His favorite chair was still there, but it no longer gave the warmth it once had. It was just a shadow, an inanimate object. Eleanor stopped and stood, staring at the chair. She remembered the time sitting beside Robert, listening to him talk about his business trips, his work, and old friends. But now, all that remained was silence, darkness covering the space. She couldn't bear the emptiness any longer. She walked into Robert's study, the room where he always sat with piles of documents and papers that were never cleaned up. It was the place where she felt his presence the most, but today, nothing was the same. On the desk lay a thin, old leather diary, as if waiting for someone to open it. Eleanor sat down, her hands trembling as she opened the diary. She noticed the smell of old paper, the faint scent of Robert still lingering in the pages. Suddenly, a small piece of paper fell out from the diary. It was carefully folded, and the writing on it made her heart choke. "Your children's greed has hurt me. Find the truth, E.R." These words were like a shock to Eleanor's mind. She couldn't understand why Robert had written these words. Why couldn't he tell her these things when he was alive? What had caused him to hide these secrets? And why E? Was she the one he entrusted all the truth to? Eleanor felt her head spinning, with questions arising in her mind without answers. How had her children changed so much that she didn't recognize it? How could she understand everything when she herself had been blinded by trust and love for her family? Why did Robert have to hide all these truths? She couldn't stay there any longer. She stood up, hid the diary in her purse, and left the study. In her heart, a strong resolve began to form. She wouldn't let this truth be buried forever. She wouldn't let Robert pass in obscurity. And she would uncover everything. The weight of the diary in her purse felt heavy, like a responsibility she had to bear. The house now felt like a cage, silent and gloomy on all sides. She couldn't sit still. She couldn't wait any longer. Every passing minute brought her closer to the truth and decisions that would change everything. The silence in the house was no longer something comfortable. It was like a reminder, a cold breeze telling her that the battle was still ongoing. Eleanor stood in the empty room, the dim lights casting faint streaks on the walls. This house, once filled with laughter, had now become a silent, cold space. Everything seemed abandoned in its stillness, its emptiness. This feeling of loss did not only stem from Robert's death, but also from what she had come to realize over the past few days. Secrets she had yet to uncover, irreparable cracks in the family she had loved for so many years. Every corner of this house held unforgettable memories. She remembered the mornings when Robert and she sat drinking coffee, talking about everything in life. Those simple moments, filled with affection. Robert was her partner, her soulmate, and the wonderful father that Eleanor had always admired. She had always thought that life would go on forever, that love and family would always be her solid foundation. But now, Robert was gone, and in his place was an emptiness she could not fill. The faint light from the desk lamp reflected on the family photo that she and Robert had taken during their year-end vacation, where they, along with their children, had enjoyed precious moments together. These photos were not just memories. but also proof of the love and unity in the family. But now, they were just fragments of a past that had passed. The children that she and Robert had carefully raised no longer looked at each other with loving eyes. Instead, there was distance, indifference, and a calculating gaze. Thomas, the eldest son, was the one Eleanor had always trusted the most. He was the child into whom Robert and she had placed all their hopes. Thomas had a strong appearance, always confident and full of ambition. But Eleanor noticed something she had never paid attention to before. Every time she looked into Thomas's eyes, she no longer saw the innocence and purity of a child, but rather coldness, hidden calculations. He was no longer the son she had hoped would lead the family, but now he felt like a stranger, someone who no longer belonged to this family. David, the youngest son, was the one who caused Eleanor the most pain. David had once been the child she loved and cherished with all her heart. He was sensitive, always needing her care and protection. But now, when she looked at David, all she saw was terrifying silence. He was no longer the son she once knew. The feeling that he had changed, had become someone else, made Eleanor's heart tighten. David wasn't just silent. He always avoided her gaze, as if he was hiding from his own emotions. But what hurt her the most was that he never faced her, never said a word about Robert's death. David's indifference made Eleanor feel a profound loneliness she couldn't explain. Eleanor couldn't stop thinking about Robert's diary. Every time she opened its pages, his words appeared vividly in her mind. Your children's greed has hurt me. Find the truth, E.R. This message kept echoing in her head, like a reminder she could never forget. Robert had left her a puzzle, a secret she had to uncover, even if it meant confronting painful truths about her own family. Eleanor knew she couldn't live in this darkness forever. She couldn't let her children destroy what Robert had worked so hard to build. But she also couldn't do anything without understanding the truth behind everything. Since Robert's death, she had tried to avoid the truth, convincing herself that her family was just going through a difficult phase. But now, with the diary and Robert's messages, Eleanor could no longer ignore it. She had to act. After careful thought, Eleanor decided to meet Sarah Chen, a lawyer Robert had mentioned in their conversations. Sarah was not only a skilled lawyer, but also someone Robert trusted. Eleanor knew she would be the only one who could help her protect Robert's legacy, and, perhaps, the only one who could help her understand what was really happening in this family. The next morning, Sarah came to Eleanor's house. She was a young woman, confident and sharp. She immediately saw the tension in Eleanor's eyes, and after hearing her story, she wasted no time in taking the first steps. Sarah helped Eleanor identify the key documents she needed to protect, and began planning to freeze Robert's assets and halt any transactions that Thomas and David might carry out. She also promised to help Eleanor investigate every detail related to Robert's assets and legacy, especially the debts he had never mentioned in everyday life. But when Sarah laid out the concrete steps, Eleanor felt a surge of anxiety. This battle was not just about legal matters. It was a psychological battle, a spiritual battle between her and her own family. No one in the family would easily accept her interference. The feeling of betrayal from her children made her feel like an outsider, as if she herself were the enemy in this conflict. After the meeting with Sarah, Eleanor began to sort through the papers related to Robert's assets and will. She realized that it wasn't just Thomas and David trying to control everything, but there were other factors pulling these events along. The debts Robert had endured, the shady contracts she had never known about, all of them were slowly coming to light. When she looked at Robert's diary once again, Eleanor felt as though she were touching a terrible secret. She couldn't bear this feeling any longer. She had to act, to uncover the truth, even if it meant facing things she never could have imagined. And in that moment, she knew there was no other choice but to confront Thomas and David, the ones she had raised and taught from a young age. She wouldn't let her children ruin what Robert had left behind. She would fight to protect her family, to protect everything that Robert and she had built over the years. Eleanor felt her heart stop beating as she walked into Robert's study. Each step seemed to weigh heavily on her chest. The house, once so familiar, now felt alien, as if she no longer belonged to it. The paintings on the walls, the little objects she and Robert had collected together, had now become lifeless, meaningless things. She sighed and looked at Robert's desk, where he had spent hours working. This desk, with its piles of paperwork, had now become a symbol of everything that was lost. Eleanor reached out and lightly brushed her hand across the surface of the desk, as if trying to feel Robert's presence again. The warmth she had once felt when he sat here was no longer there. She knew she couldn't go back to the past, but those memories still haunted her like a ghost. Every piece of paper on this desk seemed to be speaking to her, revealing things she had never understood. Robert's death was not only the loss of a husband, a father. It was the end of secrets she never anticipated. She sat down in the chair, looking at the pile of documents, letters, and contracts that Robert had left behind. She knew these papers were the key to unlocking the secrets he had kept hidden. This feeling overwhelmed her, making it hard to focus on what was in front of her. But then, her gaze stopped on a thick file. It lay among the other papers, almost as if it had been deliberately hidden. She opened it, and the pages flipped open before her eyes. It was a collection of loan contracts that Robert had signed. Eleanor couldn't believe her eyes. These debts were things she had never heard of, documents she had never seen during her life with Robert. Behind each of his signatures was a story she didn't know, a secret he had kept hidden. Did Robert know about Thomas and David's schemes? Or had he been forced to sign these contracts? A wave of dizziness made Eleanor sit down again, her hands trembling as she held the papers. The more she read, the more she realized a painful truth. Robert had been under immense pressure from his own children. They had forced him to sign these papers, perhaps even coerced him into doing so during the final months of his life. A surge of anger welled up inside her. How could her children do this to their father? How could they make him endure these things when he had always tried to protect the family, protect them? She continued flipping through the documents, and then an email printed out caught her eye. It was an email from David to Robert, short but full of implication. This email referred to a large loan Robert had signed, and there was one very important detail. "Sign this contract, or we won't be able to help you anymore. Thomas said you have to do it." These words were like a punch to her chest. Her children hadn't just deceived Robert, they had cornered him, forcing him to choose between bankruptcy or abandonment. Eleanor felt a wave of anger rise within her. Thomas, the son she had placed all her trust in, was the one who had manipulated Robert in his final months. The entire family, from top to bottom, seemed to have one common goal: personal gain, unbridled greed. But what hurt her the most was David. Her youngest son, the one she had always protected and loved, had now become a puppet in Thomas's hands. He stood silent, following his brother's instructions, never once resisting. She couldn't understand. Why was her son so easily manipulated? Why didn't he stand up to protect his father? Was it just about money? Or was he too weak, too afraid to face the truth? Eleanor paused for a moment, sitting quietly in the room full of papers, reflecting on everything she had just discovered. What she felt now was not just simple anger, but a deep, aching pain. Her children, the ones she had given all her love to, had now betrayed the very father who had dedicated his life to caring for them. Robert had been pushed into a corner from which he couldn't escape, and now she had to face this painful truth. But the truth was not something Eleanor could keep avoiding. She stood up, deciding not to let hatred and pain take over her mind any longer. She couldn't let everything continue like this. She would uncover the truth, no matter what it took. Both Robert and she had sacrificed too much for this family, and she wouldn't let this betrayal destroy it all. Immediately, Eleanor called Sarah Chen. She knew Sarah would be the only one who could help her protect Robert's legacy and, at the same time, help her bring everything to light. Sarah was a skilled and reputable lawyer, but more than that, she understood the situation, and Eleanor felt at ease knowing she had her support. Sarah would help her gather the documents and evidence to prove that the contracts and papers Robert signed had been manipulated, and Eleanor would not let her children continue to deceive. After the phone call, Eleanor felt somewhat relieved. Although she knew this battle wouldn't be easy, at least she had the support she needed. Sarah would help her take the case to court, help her prove that her children had exploited Robert, and that she wouldn't let the truth be buried. However, she knew that facing Thomas and David would not be simple. Neither of them would easily give up their interests, and she would have to deal with their lies and strong resistance. That night, when everything had calmed down, Eleanor sat alone in the living room, looking out the window. The night had fallen, and the house had sunk into an eerie silence. The feeling of loneliness resurfaced, but this time, it didn't make her weak. She felt strength within herself, the strength of the truth she would fight to protect. She wouldn't let this family be destroyed by greed and deceit. Eleanor stood up, walking over to Robert's desk, where his diary still lay, like a reminder. Each page was a step toward the truth she would uncover. And no matter how difficult the road ahead, she would not stop. This battle had only just begun. Eleanor stood in her study, where she and Robert had spent countless hours discussing important decisions in life. This room, where they dreamed of the future and solved family issues together, now felt cold and silent. Everything was still. Only familiar objects and memories remained in the space. Eleanor looked around. The items on the desk were the same as before. Family photos, piles of papers left untidy. But it seemed as if all of them were missing an important part, a part that she could never replace. Her eyes stopped on Robert's armchair, where he always sat whenever he returned home after a long day of work. It was the chair that always gave her comfort when she saw him sitting there. But now, the chair only held the indentations of old memories, a mark of his absence. No more laughter, no more stories he would tell her every evening. The feeling of emptiness consumed the room, as if this house was no longer the place they had shared for so many years. Everything had changed too quickly. This feeling of loss overwhelmed Eleanor, making it impossible to hold back her tears. She turned to look at the window, where the faint light of the afternoon poured in. The view outside suddenly became blurred. The gray clouds drifted by, signaling an impending storm. But in her heart, that rain couldn't soothe her loneliness. She felt as if she were lost in her own home. Everything was too silent, too vague. Robert's words, the conversations they had, were now only ghosts haunting her mind. But one thing Eleanor knew for certain was that she couldn't live in this sorrow forever. She couldn't let Robert's memories take over her life without taking action. She had lost him, but she couldn't let what he left behind be destroyed. That's why she decided to act, to protect what was left, to preserve the legacy Robert had worked so hard to build. But not only that, she had to face her children, the ones she had loved and nurtured all these years. Both Thomas and David had changed. Both children, whom she had spent her whole life caring for, were now strangers she couldn't recognize. Thomas, the eldest son, was no longer the son she had trusted. He had changed, and changed too quickly. She couldn't understand why he had become so cold, why he only cared about property and personal gain. Robert, no matter what happened, always tried to maintain a peaceful family, and despite all the hardships, he always loved his children. But Thomas seemed to have gotten caught up in personal desires, forgetting all the values Robert had taught him. David, her youngest son, was perhaps the one whose change Eleanor couldn't explain. David wasn't as cold as Thomas, but his indifference hurt her heart just as much. He said nothing about Robert's death, not a word of sympathy, not a tear. He avoided her gaze, as if trying to escape his true feelings. Eleanor remembered the days when David was a child, always seeking her advice, needing her protection. But now, he felt like a stranger. She couldn't help but feel heartbroken, realizing that David was no longer the son she had unconditionally loved. The truth Eleanor had to face was that both her children had changed, and they no longer wanted to preserve what she and Robert had worked so hard to build. Their words, their actions, made her realize that not only Robert, but she herself was being betrayed. She felt deceived, left alone in a world full of traps and lies. No longer able to hesitate, Eleanor decided to act. She had to do something to protect Robert's legacy, to protect what he had left for her and for the family. But not only that, she had to face the truth about Thomas and David, to find a way to bring the truth to light. The secrets she didn't know would be revealed, no matter how painful they were. The next day, Eleanor called Sarah Chen, the lawyer Robert had trusted. Sarah was someone Robert had mentioned many times. She was the only person Eleanor felt she could trust in this situation. Sarah had helped Robert a lot with legal matters, and she knew she would help her find the truth. Sarah came to meet her that afternoon. She was a young woman, smart, strong, and full of passion. After listening to Eleanor recount everything, Sarah didn't seem surprised. She simply looked at her with understanding. She knew that this fight wouldn't be easy, but it wasn't impossible to win. Sarah told Eleanor that the first step was to gather all the important documents: loan contracts, payment receipts, and papers related to Robert's assets and will. Sarah said that if Eleanor could prove that Robert had been manipulated in his financial decisions, she would have a chance to protect his assets and bring everything to light. Eleanor knew this wouldn't be easy, but at least she had help from someone experienced. The following days, Eleanor and Sarah worked together to collect evidence. Eleanor sifted through Robert's documents, the contracts, and papers she had never paid attention to. And in each of those papers, she found clear signs of manipulation, from the loans to the contracts Robert hadn't known about. All of this made Eleanor feel like she was opening a door to a dark truth she had never imagined. The more she investigated, the more anger she felt inside. Her children, the ones she had loved with all her heart, had made Robert endure so much during the final months of his life. She couldn't let everything go too far. She would fight for the truth. She wouldn't let her family be destroyed by schemes and lies. Finally, Eleanor decided on something she never thought she'd do. She would have to face Thomas and David to tell them about what she had discovered. She wouldn't let them continue hiding the truth. She wouldn't let them take advantage of Robert's weakness and hers. The next morning, as the first light of day began to shine into the living room of the house, Eleanor felt an unusual heaviness. It wasn't the chill of autumn or the usual silence that follows Robert's death. It was a feeling as though something was about to happen, as if a storm were approaching, even though no one could see its signs. Eleanor walked into her study, the place where Robert had often sat with piles of disorganized papers reflecting a man who dedicated himself wholeheartedly to his work. Today, everything was the same, but the warmth of Robert was gone. She slowly sat down in his chair, gazing at the familiar items. In that space, everything seemed still. Even the air felt heavy. A numb sensation spread through her, as if she too were becoming part of the stillness. But Eleanor didn't have time for lamentations anymore. She had decided to act. She could no longer hesitate. Robert was gone, but life had to continue, and she knew she couldn't let these betraying children continue to deceive and manipulate. Over the past days, she had come to understand one thing. Only the truth could resolve everything, and she would uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. That morning, Thomas called her. His voice, as usual, was soft, but it still carried a hint of threat. "Mom, I might come see you this afternoon, but before I get there, I want you to understand something," Thomas began, his tone showing no attempt to hide his attitude. "If you don't sign the papers to sell the house, if you don't let me manage your father's assets, don't blame me if things get complicated. You'll regret it." Eleanor stood frozen, unable to believe what she had just heard. Her son, Thomas, could say such things. A wave of outrage surged through her like electricity. How many times had she dreamed that this son would be the one to inherit Robert's legacy, the one to carry the family forward? But now, he was standing there, threatening his own mother for money. These threats weren't just about property. They were a threat to the family bond she had spent her whole life building. She clenched her lips, trying to control her emotions, not letting Thomas hear the tremor in her voice. She knew that if she showed any weakness, he would immediately exploit it. "I won't sign anything if that's what you want me to do," Eleanor responded, her voice steady but filled with hidden pain. Thomas was silent for a moment, as if surprised that his mother had responded this way. "You'll regret it," he said, then hung up the phone. Eleanor set the phone down on the table, sitting still for a few minutes. The words of threat still echoed in her mind, She felt a threat not only from Thomas, but from the entire family. Everything that she and Robert had built seemed to be violated, trampled under the hands of the very children she had raised. But she couldn't allow herself to be defeated. Robert had taught her to always stand up and fight for what she believed was right, and she would do just that. The tension inside Eleanor grew. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't protect Robert and her family if she didn't face the truth. This battle was not just about property, but about dignity, about the respect that she and Robert had for each other throughout their lives. She wouldn't let it all be destroyed by the ambition and greed of her children. Finally, the decision became clear. Eleanor called Sarah Chen, the lawyer she had invited earlier, to prepare for the next steps. Sarah had helped her collect evidence about the forged documents Thomas and David had created. She had helped her put together a plan to stop any financial transactions Thomas might carry out. That afternoon, Thomas came to the house as scheduled. He stood at the door, his face cold, but his eyes filled with arrogance and confidence. He knew that she wouldn't dare do anything, that she wouldn't dare oppose him. "I told you, if you don't listen to me, you'll regret it," Thomas said as he stepped into the living room. He didn't greet her. He just stood there, looking at her with calculating eyes. Eleanor looked him straight in the eye, feeling the tension rising within her. "Thomas," she said, her voice firm, "you can't do this. You can't deceive your father in his last months. You can't destroy what he built." Thomas sneered derisively, not hiding his sarcasm. "You really think I care about his legacy? No, you're wrong. This is all I want. I want to control everything, and I will get it. You can stop resisting. I'll take it all." Eleanor felt a cold chill run down her spine. Thomas wasn't just talking about money. He was talking about power, about control. She had once thought he was the son she could trust, but now, this truth hit her like a cold splash of water, waking her up from the illusions she had long held. However, she couldn't let Thomas continue like this. "You don't have the right to do this, Thomas. You can persuade everyone else, but you can't persuade yourself. You can't deny the truth that Robert loved you, and you've hurt him." Thomas's face changed, his calm demeanor faltering, but he quickly regained his composure, gritting his teeth. "So what will you do?" he asked, his tone calm but full of challenge. "Are you going to sue me? You have no evidence, and I will win." Eleanor didn't respond. She just stared at him. Inside, a new determination rose within her. She wouldn't let this pass easily. She wouldn't let Thomas and David manipulate Robert, and she wouldn't let them destroy everything that she and Robert had built over the years. She stood up and walked toward the door. "I will find the truth," she said, her voice resolute. "And if you continue down this path, I will face you, not in this family, but in court. We will let the truth decide everything." Thomas remained silent, staring at her, his eyes full of anger, but there was also a hint of worry. However, he didn't say anything more, just turned and walked out the door. Eleanor stood there, her hands clenched tightly, feeling a determination stronger than ever before. This battle had just begun, and she would not back down. Eleanor sat in her study, where the faint light from the lamps reflected off the family pictures that had faded with time. This vast house still held the traces of the past, but now it felt emptier than ever. Robert was no longer here, and with each passing day, the memories of him seemed to blur. But in Eleanor's heart, those memories would never fade. Every corner of this house, every object contained a part of her life with him, a part of the love and connection they had painstakingly built. But today, the stillness of the house was not just a feeling of loss. Yes, Robert was gone, but she was no longer merely living in the shadow of sorrow. The battle she now faced was about the truth, about what she had discovered and what she would soon have to confront. She couldn't let her family be destroyed by greed and deceit. Robert was gone, but the legacy he left must be protected. Yesterday, after meeting with Sarah Chen, Eleanor felt a slight sense of relief. Sarah, the lawyer Robert had trusted, was not only a legal expert, but someone whom Eleanor felt she could trust in this fight. Sarah had helped her lay out a detailed plan to protect Robert's legacy, starting with freezing assets and halting any financial transactions Thomas and David might carry out. But Eleanor knew that legal decisions alone would not be enough. To confront Thomas and David, she needed concrete evidence, undeniable proof. She needed to understand every detail in the contracts and financial papers they had manipulated. And to do this, she would need the help of people outside her family. She recalled the time she had spoken with Sarah, when she had suggested bringing in a financial investigator to uncover the shady transactions Thomas and David had made. This was the next crucial step, and though it wouldn't be easy, Eleanor knew there was no other choice but to continue. As she was preparing for the next meeting with Sarah, Eleanor received an unexpected phone call. On the other end of the line was a soft voice, but one that also carried a firm resolve. "Hello, can you meet with me?" The voice came from Sarah. "I have information you'll want to hear." Eleanor felt a surge of anxiety, but quickly composed herself. "Of course, I can meet with you anytime. When can we meet?" "4 p.m. today, at the cafe near my office. I have some important information that you need to know," Sarah replied. Eleanor felt a sense of urgency, but she also realized that this was an opportunity she couldn't miss. She knew this could be a major step forward in resolving everything. That afternoon, Eleanor met Sarah at the small cafe, where they had met many times over the past months. Sarah was sitting at their usual table, the light from the desk lamp highlighting her sharp features and determined expression. "What news do you have?" Eleanor asked, sitting down and looking straight into Sarah's eyes. Sarah didn't respond immediately. She quietly placed a bag on the table and took out a thick stack of documents. She looked at Eleanor for a moment, then spoke in a calm but serious tone. "I've contacted a financial investigator I trust, and the result is—" Sarah paused for a moment, as if she wanted to make this moment truly meaningful. "There's a series of shady transactions Thomas and David have made in recent months. They've been trying to transfer Robert's assets to shell companies, thereby avoiding financial scrutiny." Eleanor felt her heart sink. Everything she had suspected was now becoming a reality. The children she had raised, the ones she had nurtured, were now manipulators, deceivers. She couldn't believe what she had just heard. But at that moment, she knew there was no time to hesitate anymore. "So, what do we do next?" Eleanor asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the anger and disappointment rising inside her. "We need to gather more evidence from the companies they're linked to. And to do that, you'll need to cooperate with a financial expert who has experience in uncovering fraudulent transactions," Sarah replied, her face full of determination. You'll also need to prepare for a confrontation. We can't keep going in circles forever." Eleanor nodded. This was not just a legal battle. It was a battle for trust, for respect within the family. What she was doing was not only to protect the assets, but to protect the truth, Robert's integrity, and her family. The next day, Eleanor and Sarah continued gathering the necessary documents. The evidence they found not only broke Eleanor's heart more, but also shed light on the dark scheming within her family. But she couldn't stop now. This was the time she had to face the truth. That weekend, Eleanor decided to call a family meeting. She didn't just want to confront Thomas and David. She wanted them to see that she would not back down. The family had once been a united whole, and now she would do everything in her power to preserve those values, even if she had to face every painful truth. On the day of the meeting, Eleanor stood facing her children in the living room, where she and Robert had sat together so many times, where she had always thought the family would remain strong. But now, the atmosphere in the room was suffocating, full of tension. Thomas and David were silent, not looking at each other, their gazes avoiding one another. But Eleanor knew this was the decisive moment. She took a deep breath, looked directly into both their eyes, and began to speak. "I know everything. You can't deceive me anymore. I've gathered enough evidence, and I won't stop until the truth is brought to light." Thomas looked at her, his eyes gleaming with calculation, but there was a hint of fear in them. "You can't do anything. Do you think you can win? You have no evidence. You can't fight me," he said, his voice full of challenge. "You think I will let this go? I have loved you both with all my heart. But you have betrayed me, betrayed Robert. Today, I will not let you continue to destroy everything we had," Eleanor responded, her voice cold but full of resolve. Eleanor stood in the living room, her hands hanging loosely at her sides, staring at the faces of Thomas and David. Neither of them said a word, but the tension in the air was palpable. The light from the window poured in, making the space feel even heavier, as if the shadows in their hearts were slowly overtaking everything. Eleanor felt as if she were standing between two worlds. One of truth, of everything she had sacrificed, and another, where the children she had loved were now drowning in greed and lies. Before her stood the two sons she had nurtured and raised from the very beginning of their lives. But now, they were no longer the innocent children she once knew. They had grown up, changed, and there was no longer any semblance of family. Thomas, the one she had once placed all her hopes in, was now the first to turn his back on her, ready to do anything to seize power, to claim his father's inheritance. And David, her youngest son, the one she had always protected and loved unconditionally, was silent, standing next to his brother as if he had abandoned everything, no longer the person she had cared for. A wave of anger surged within Eleanor, but she knew that if she let her emotions take over, she would accomplish nothing. She had to remain calm, confront them with reason. No matter how heartbroken she felt, no matter how badly she wanted to cry, she couldn't let her weakness affect her decisions. She had to protect the truth, had to protect the legacy Robert had left behind. She took a deep breath, then turned to look at Thomas. "I know everything," she said, her voice firm and strong. "You can't deceive me anymore. I've gathered enough evidence, and nothing can be hidden anymore." Thomas looked at her, his gaze still as cold as before, but there was a hint of fear in it. as if he knew that his game was up. He opened his mouth, but then closed it again, unsure of what to say. "What do you think you can do? You have no power. You can't fight me." Thomas finally spoke, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Eleanor wouldn't let herself be subdued. "What do you think, Thomas? Do you think I'll remain silent while you continue to exploit your father's death?" She stepped closer to him, her eyes sharp as a knife, not showing an ounce of weakness. "You've betrayed your father. You've destroyed this family." David, the son who had remained silent throughout the conversation, finally spoke. "Mom, don't do this. We just want to do what's best for the family," David said, his voice seeming distant. But Eleanor couldn't hear any empathy in his words. His voice lacked the remorse, the sincerity she had hoped for from a son. He didn't have the firmness needed when facing this situation. "What's best for the family? Do you know that what you're doing is destroying everything your father worked for?" Eleanor responded, her voice colder than ever. "This is not about money, about property. This is about respect. Robert spent his life protecting this family, and now you treat him like this." Thomas couldn't maintain his composure anymore. "You don't understand anything, can't you see? We need to move on. We need to do something to continue. You just want to hold everything for yourself," he said, his voice growing sharper, his eyes turning cold. "You can't keep living in the past." Eleanor felt the pain in her heart growing, but she didn't let it show. This was a confrontation she couldn't back down from. She couldn't let Thomas's words weaken her. "You don't understand anything, Thomas," she said, each word carrying tremendous weight. "You don't understand that this family is all that Robert and I have built. You only see money, power, but those are not what really matter." Thomas fell silent for a moment, then looked down at his hands as if he felt that something in her words was true. But he couldn't admit it. He couldn't accept that he was wrong, that everything he had fought for was crumbling right before his eyes. Eleanor turned to David, who had remained silent since the beginning, his eyes filled with inner conflict. "David, you were the last one I hoped would stand up to protect this family. You can't remain silent anymore. You have to decide. I didn't raise you this way, to abandon the family." David shook his head, as if trying to find an explanation for his actions. "Mom, you don't understand. We have to do things our way," he said, his voice full of confusion. "You and Dad were too rigid. You didn't realize that everything has changed. This era is different now." Eleanor could no longer bear it. "Yes, the era has changed, but that doesn't mean we have to lose all that is right. Do you think you can change everything with money and power? You're wrong, David. Those things can't replace love, respect, and honor." The room fell silent for a long moment. Thomas and David said nothing further. Eleanor's eyes never left them. She knew the truth had been revealed, and no matter what they said, she would not change her decision. She could no longer live in this betrayal. "We will go to court," Eleanor said, her voice full of resolve. "I won't let you continue to deceive, and I will protect your father's legacy. If you think you can keep manipulating everything, I'll prove you wrong." Thomas looked at her, his eyes flashing with anger. But beneath the anger, Eleanor saw a trace of fear. He knew this fight wouldn't be easy. As for David, he just stood there, head lowered, saying nothing. But in that silence, Eleanor saw confusion, inner conflict in him, something she couldn't explain at that moment. She turned and walked out of the living room, the sense of determination rising in her heart. This battle wasn't just a legal confrontation. It was a battle for dignity, for everything she and Robert had built. She wouldn't let it all be destroyed by lies and greed. She would protect this family no matter what challenges lay ahead. Eleanor stood in her study, once again looking around the room, filled with documents and old family photos that Robert had cherished. Every corner of the room seemed to still hold his memories, but everything had become empty. Robert was no longer here, and Eleanor felt as if she were living in an unending darkness. Everything now was no longer about mourning Robert, but about the truth, about what she had to do to protect her family and to protect what he had worked so hard to build. Her life had changed since Robert's passing. The battle was no longer just a legal one, but one within herself. The children she had borne, raised, and loved were now the ones she had to confront, the ones she had to fight to protect what was left of her family. And Thomas, her eldest son, was now the one she had to face directly. She could not forget that meeting when Thomas had come to the house with his arrogance and confidence so overwhelming that it made her feel disgusted. He had come, challenging her, trying to pressure her into signing documents she knew were wrong. But that was just the beginning. Eleanor understood that this was just Thomas's game, and she wouldn't easily be drawn into it. A few days after that meeting, she began preparing for the lawsuit. The lawyer, Sarah Chen, whom she trusted, had helped her gather enough evidence to confront Thomas and David. The documents, the evidence of the fraudulent transactions and financial manipulation by Thomas not only stunned her, but made her feel as if she were facing an unimaginable reality. The contracts Robert had signed, the assets he had worked so hard to build, were now being exploited by Thomas to seize them. As for David, although he had not directly participated in these schemes, his indifference and silence made it impossible for her to forgive him. Eleanor knew this was a fight she couldn't lose. She had to protect Robert's legacy, had to protect what he had built. But confronting Thomas wasn't going to be simple. He had planned everything carefully, and she knew that to defeat him, she needed the help of outsiders, experts who could help her uncover everything. The day Thomas was brought to court, the tension in Eleanor's heart was indescribable. She had prepared for every possible scenario, but she couldn't avoid the feeling of anxiety. She knew that without enough evidence, without the support of Sarah and the witnesses they had gathered, everything could fall apart. However, she would not allow herself to back down. She had to fight, not only for Robert, but for herself, for this family. The trial began, and Thomas sat across from her, his face cold, his eyes filled with confidence. He didn't show any signs of worry, even though all the evidence Eleanor and Sarah had gathered pointed to his financial manipulation. Thomas had prepared for every situation, and in his eyes, losing it all wasn't a big deal. He only cared about protecting his own interests, and he would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. Eleanor felt her anger rise as she looked at Thomas. He sat there, cold, as if nothing could make him afraid. But in her heart, she knew the truth would eventually prevail. Her life had proven that no matter the obstacles, she could always overcome them. The judge began reading the documents and evidence. Sarah stood next to Eleanor, explaining each detail of the fraudulent transactions Thomas had carried out. Every word she spoke, every document presented made Thomas grow increasingly uneasy. He started to lose his composure, though he still tried to maintain his calm exterior. These documents clearly show that Mr. Robert was manipulated in his financial decisions. He did not sign these contracts voluntarily. Everything was orchestrated to benefit the defendant, Sarah said, her voice steady. Thomas could no longer maintain his calm. He began to argue, but the confidence in his voice was fading. This is a misunderstanding. Everything was done according to the proper procedure, my mother. Thomas tried to justify himself, but his voice was no longer sharp. It trembled. Eleanor could not sit still anymore. She stood up, staring directly at Thomas. You didn't just deceive your father. You've deceived this whole family. What you've done is wrong, and now you have to face the consequences, she said, each word cutting through his excuses like a knife. Thomas looked at his mother, his eyes no longer confident but filled with surprise and fear. Mom, you can't do this. You'll destroy everything, he said, his voice filled with anxiety. Eleanor didn't respond. She just looked at him, as if she had said everything she needed to say. The truth could no longer be hidden, and she would do everything to protect what Robert had left behind. The trial continued, but Eleanor no longer felt the anxiety she had at the beginning. Every piece of evidence, every word Sarah spoke, every testimony from the witnesses made everything clear. Thomas had nowhere to hide. Step by step, he had to face the truth. Finally, when the judge announced the verdict, Thomas could no longer maintain his composure. He knew he had lost. Everything he had tried to do, everything he had prepared for, had collapsed. He stood up, his face full of despair, and walked out of the courtroom without saying a word. Eleanor watched him leave, a part of her heart still aching. After all, he was still the son she had raised, the one she had loved for so many years. But now, she could not continue to shield those wrongdoings. What mattered now was that she had won, not only for Robert's legacy, but for the dignity and honor of her family. She turned back, looked at Sarah, and thanked her for her help. But even in this victory, Eleanor still felt a sense of emptiness. Robert was gone, and she could not bring back what had been lost. But at least she had done the right thing. Eleanor sat in the living room of the house she had lived in for so many years. This house, once filled with the laughter of her family, now sank into a frightening silence. The family portraits, the familiar objects, all seemed to have lost the life that she and Robert had created. The feeling of loss still weighed heavily on her heart, but there was a strange change within her, a feeling she couldn't explain. She was no longer completely broken. The loss no longer felt the same, and a flame inside her was beginning to burn more fiercely. Looking out the window, the weak morning light filtered through the leaves, softening the gloom in the room. Still, Eleanor felt a clear sense of what needed to be done next. What she'd gone through, the pain, the betrayal. None of it could destroy her. She had lost her life partner, but she couldn't continue living in that sorrow. It was time to act. This battle was not just about what had happened to Robert, but about what she needed to do to protect her family, to protect the values that she and he had built. Since Robert's death, Eleanor had faced many unexpected challenges, from the betrayal of her children to schemes to seize his assets. She had fought not only against these, but also against her own feelings. The children she had loved, who had once been the children she taught and protected, were now strangers in her own family. But one thing she realized was life had to go on. She couldn't keep living in the darkness of the past. She couldn't let this loss continue to dominate her life. She had to move forward because she knew she didn't have much time left. More importantly, she realized that, though everything had changed, she could still create something good for herself and for those who needed help. Eleanor began thinking about a way to continue Robert's legacy. While everything seemed to be falling apart, there was still one thing she could hold on to, and that was the fact that she could help others, just as Robert had done throughout his life. She decided to establish a charity, the Robert Vance Legacy Fund, aimed at helping the elderly who had been financially manipulated, those who had suffered exploitation and deceit from unscrupulous people in society. This wasn't just about protecting Robert's legacy, but about continuing to contribute to the community, continuing the values that Robert and she had cherished for so many years. And in a surprising moment, Eleanor realized that she herself also needed to heal, not just with those around her, but also with herself. Along with Sarah Chen, the lawyer she had trusted all this time, Eleanor set to work on establishing the charity. The following days passed quickly as she and Sarah met with financial experts, lawyers, and others with experience in managing charitable funds. She didn't just want the fund to help the elderly, but she wanted it to become a symbol of fairness and compassion in society. Robert had always believed in doing the right thing, in helping the vulnerable, and she wanted this fund to carry on those values. One weekend morning, as Eleanor was working with Sarah, she received a call from David. This time, his voice wasn't silent, but filled with sincerity, exhaustion. "Mom, I want to meet with you," David said, his voice sounding weak. "I have something I want to say." Eleanor sensed the change in her son's voice. Perhaps this was the first time in all this time that David truly wanted to face her, to speak out about what he had buried. Eleanor didn't say anything, simply agreeing. "Okay, I'll meet you, but only when you're ready to say everything." A few days later, Eleanor met David at a small cafe, one they had visited on weekends with Robert. Her eldest son had grown in her heart, but he was also the one she hadn't fully understood during these past years. David sat there, looking tired, but also full of concern. When she sat down opposite him, he didn't say anything, just quietly looked at her, as if searching for the right words. "Mom," David began, his voice choking, "I'm sorry. I don't know what to say anymore. I was wrong, and I feel so regretful." For the first time in months, Eleanor saw sincerity in David's eyes. She realized that, at last, he had recognized what he had done. Although David's actions before had hurt her deeply, now, in that silence, she could see the truth beginning to emerge. "Mom, I don't understand why I did this," David continued, his eyes full of tears. "I didn't understand the love you had for me. I didn't see the sacrifices you and Dad made. I've betrayed you. I didn't stand up when you needed me." Eleanor looked at her son, her gaze no longer cold or angry as before. His words reminded her of the moments when David was a child. She had loved him unconditionally, but now he stood before her, acknowledging his mistakes. "I don't expect you to apologize," Eleanor said, her voice gentle, but with a powerful strength in every word. "I just want you to realize that this family is more important than anything else. Nothing can replace love and respect in a family." David lowered his head, not saying anything more. She didn't need any further explanation. What was needed now was healing, helping David find himself again, and she was ready for that. The conversation ended, and though there was no clear conclusion, Eleanor felt a shift within herself. David hadn't abandoned her, and she hadn't abandoned him. They would continue together, overcoming the difficulties ahead. She had not given up hope for her son's change. A year had passed since Eleanor began the battle to protect Robert's legacy. During that time, she had not only faced her children, but also the ghosts of the past, the pain she had to accept in order to keep moving forward. The vast house that she and Robert had built together now held memories. But it was no longer a place of loss. The atmosphere in the house gradually returned to the peacefulness she had always desired. Every morning, Eleanor felt like she was living in a space free from the shadows of betrayal and pain. She knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, but at least she had found her strength again, and that was more important than anything. Today, she was preparing to visit the charity center she had founded, the Robert Vance Legacy Fund. This was one of the decisions she made after fighting for the truth, protecting Robert's legacy, and safeguarding the values he had lived by. The fund was not just an organization that helped the elderly who had been financially manipulated, but also a way for Eleanor to continue Robert's legacy. It was a testament to the love she and he had for the vulnerable in society. Robert had always believed that if we could help just one person, even a little, then our lives would have more meaning, and Eleanor was going to do that, even if it meant fighting with all her strength. When Eleanor arrived at the center, she felt as though she was being reinvigorated. Everyone at the center greeted her with eyes full of respect and gratitude. She was not only the founder of the fund, but also the leader, the source of encouragement for everyone who came here seeking help. The fund not only helped the elderly who were financially manipulated, but also provided emotional support, helping them regain confidence and peace in their lives. Every day, she felt a change within herself as she saw the fund grow, helping more and more people. In a regular meeting of the fund, Eleanor stood up to speak to the members and volunteers. Her voice was steady, full of determination. The legacy that Robert left for me is not just about material assets. The greatest legacy he left is the values he lived and worked for throughout his life. We are doing wonderful work, and I believe that if we continue with passion and perseverance, we will help even more people. Let's protect the values Robert worked so hard to build. The eyes of the members brightened as they listened to her. A sense of pride and enthusiasm spread through the room. Eleanor felt that she truly mattered, and nothing could stop her from continuing this mission. She had found a new purpose in life, a purpose not only for herself, but also for those in need. That day, when she left the center, Eleanor's steps seemed lighter. She no longer carried the burden of loss. Her children, although still with unresolved wounds, but at least now, she could face them without feeling betrayed. She understood that the past couldn't be changed, but she could change the way she viewed and faced the future. She had done the right thing, and now she no longer had to live in that inner conflict. Eleanor returned to the house, the place that used to be filled with laughter and family stories. Every corner of this house was tied to a memory with Robert. However, the house no longer held loneliness or sadness. It had become a symbol of her resilience, of what she had overcome and what she would continue to do. The photos on the wall, the items in the house, now became memories that could never fade, imprints that could never be erased from her heart. One evening, as the light from the window shone outside, Eleanor sat in the living room, looking at a picture of Robert. She smiled gently, feeling his presence in every corner of the house. A year had passed since he left, but she felt his love still with her, still present in everything she did. Robert was not only a husband, a father, but he was also a soulmate, a companion throughout her life. Eleanor gently took out Robert's journal, the book she had kept hidden all this time. Each page was filled with Robert's thoughts, his feelings during his last days. His words had been a great source of encouragement for her throughout this journey. "The greed of your children has caused me pain." His words appeared in her mind, reminding her why she had to fight. But now, looking at what she had done, she felt a great sense of pride. Robert would be proud of her. She looked out the window, where the lights on the street shimmered. Although there were still challenges ahead, Eleanor felt ready to face them. She no longer felt alone or left behind. She had regained her strength, found her purpose. Life wasn't always easy, but she knew that with determination, with love, she could overcome any difficulty. Eleanor stood up, deciding to go out, to attend a meeting for the fund. She would continue the mission that she and Robert had built, not just for herself, but for everyone who needed help. Life went on, and she would not allow herself to stop. With each passing day, she felt stronger, and she knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she would never give up. She smiled, gently closing the living room door behind her, as if closing a new chapter in her life. Then, she stepped outside, carrying with her the peace she had found throughout these difficult months. The battle that Eleanor had gone through was not just a fight for assets or power, but a journey to regain justice, truth, and dignity. The children she had nurtured and loved were now the very ones she had to confront, and every step in this battle was a step toward liberation, not only for Robert, but also for herself. When the schemes were exposed, when the lies were laid bare in the light, Eleanor realized that true revenge was not in hurting others, but in standing firm, in protecting what is most precious. The legacy that Robert left behind was not just material wealth, but unconditional love, resilience in every person he touched. Eleanor triumphed, not because she had superior strength, but because she never gave up on the values that she and Robert had built together. And now, with the charity she founded, with all the progress she had made in protecting the vulnerable, Eleanor was not only healing her own wounds, but also helping others. She had not only found peace within herself, but was spreading it to those around her. Eleanor's story reminds us that sometimes in life, pain and loss are not the end, but a turning point to rediscover our strength and purpose. To overcome betrayal, we need to stand firm, keep a pure heart, and remain full of compassion. So, what do you think about the battle that Eleanor faced? Would you stand up like she did, or choose to give up in the face of life's challenges? Please share your thoughts in the comments below, as your reflections will help us all learn and grow together. Remember, no matter how big the difficulties may be, the most important thing is that we never give up on hope and love, things that will guide us through any challenge.